How's everyone doing today? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, live today on Tuesday, July the 2nd. A very heavy AFC South episode I wanted to talk about on today's show. So, we're going to start off with a discussion. Have the Jacksonville Jaguars done enough to meet the high expectations that were created from the massive contract that Trevor Lawrence got? One of the highest paid quarterbacks. Expectations comes along with that, so we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to get into the final offseason grades for the last division in the series, the AFC South, going through all four teams and seeing who had the best offseason before we get into the Los Angeles Chargers and talking some more takeaways that not all of us here on the outside could really delve into, and how some inside sources are talking more about what they're noticing differently this year with the Los Angeles Chargers, plus some more on today's show. Before I get started, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments, use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net. If you have any questions or comments, use that link and I'll be able to see your questions pop up on my chat box. I'll read it on air, and that way potentially take the conversation or get a different point of view from what I'm saying around any topic we talk about today. So once again, if you guys would, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a massive help for this show as well as the network. But with that being said, we could just start off right away with something I've been thinking about that has been developing, I believe, over the last few weeks now. It's been a few weeks since Trevor Lawrence got his $55 million salary, part of a massive deal to make him tied for the highest paid quarterback in the NFL. And from that deal, I just believe that you get a lot of money, and obviously teams, it's a very drawn out thing. It's a very long process to get that big of a contract, especially in this market where teams are hesitant to try and get, below the market price on their quarterbacks. Everyone's trying to get it there in time to beat out the other teams. But when you finally get it, it's great. You probably deserve it with how you play it. At least the team believes that. But now there comes, the hard work, the expectations really, with having such a massive contract like that. And especially with Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars, just because especially, like I mentioned, how he was in sort of a race with Jordan Love, Dak Prescott, and Tua to see who would get their next extension. And Jordan Love and Tua have sort of still been in a weird position. Trying to get it done before training camp seems to be their goal. So they still have a little bit of time here to work with. And Dak Prescott, nobody really knows what's going on with them. Are they going to try and extend him first, or maybe CeeDee now, since he is presumed to be holding out of training camp? So those are in a weird situation. Jacksonville did a good thing by getting it done, but the price now, getting paid as one of the highest paid quarterbacks, comes with those expectations that I mentioned. And not only that he beat the other quarterbacks out who are also trying to get paid, but also his production in the NFL based on his first 3 years. First year with Urban Meyer, then the second year was arguably his best one. Then you disappoint a little bit last year by not making the playoffs after being 8-3 going into the last 6 games of the regular season. Then you end that on a 1-5 record to close it out, and you completely miss the playoffs. And now you're thrown into this weird spot where you're coming off a disappointing season where the Jaguars saw the performance of the entire team, but now they pay you accordingly as to what they believe you could become. So because they're paying you on projecting you to be a lot better than what you showed in 2023, that's where I get a little bit uneasy about whether or not only Trevor Lawrence can meet those expectations, but the Jaguars as a whole. Have they done enough as a team to build around Trevor Lawrence and him himself to meet these massive expectations? Some of the biggest doubts I have with the Jaguars is that there's a lot of newness, which could bring a lot of positives, but still there needs to be that transition period with the wide receiver group, Gabe Davis coming in, Brian Thomas being drafted from LSU. Then you also have Christian Kirk there as well, Evan Ingram. So majority of the players that you had already in Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram is a positive thing for this team. But Gabe Davis coming in, what's his role going to be? Is he going to be considered the number 2 receiver? How is Brian Thomas going to come along in his first year as a rookie? all those things you have to figure out how the pecking order goes, if that makes sense. So that is one thing. Another development that I would like to see sort of plan out itself would be the offensive line, because the interior part of that offensive line was considered the weakest point, but now they bring in a very good center, a very underrated center in Mitch Morse from Buffalo. They signed him in free agency, as well as guard Ezra Cleveland. So it should be better, but again, the adjustment like the wide receiving period, especially with a new center coming in, that transition, that handoff in a way, by handing the ball off to Trevor Lawrence, hiking the ball to Trevor Lawrence, that's a lot more important and a lot more difficult than it really seems, with the timing and just getting the flow and feel of a new center in there with a quarterback. So that's also going to be something new that the Jaguars have to get, efficient doing in a way to start off the year. And then the last doubt I have, it doesn't really have to do too much with the Jaguars, but just the fact that the rest of the division has gone significantly better. You look at the Texans, obviously. I'm a really big fan of what the Titans are doing, and even the Colts. Last year they didn't have their quarterback. They bring back Michael Pittman, A.D. Mitchell, Jonathan Taylor. They have some very impressive names, so even them, to an extent, are doing some very good things. And now the Jaguars, it's not to say that they're the worst team where they haven't done anything, but it's going to be weird because everybody else is getting better, and you're not just going to have a great start to the season, at least in my opinion, like they did last year, where they were the number one team in the entire AFC at one point, but then they sort of started to slow down. The Chiefs got up there, the Ravens got up there, and the Jaguars just ended up missing the playoffs in the end. So that's something else that comes with experience, but I still have my doubts about that as well. And just in general, people will be expecting more after this whole 3-year span with Trevor Lawrence. I touched on it briefly before, because you had that first year already. The expectations are sort of there because you're a number one overall pick, but in hindsight, looking at what he had to go through with Urban Meyer, I think people will give him a pass for that. It almost doesn't really count because you weren't really given much of a chance in what Urban Meyer was doing as a coach and that whole organization just overall. Then you look at the second year, Doug Peterson comes in, and you have the best season of your career, and that's awesome. People from that point on are expecting, Trevor Lawrence to get better, and then after what they would have expected to be a very good 2023, and it started off that way, then it dies off, and now, like I was feeling, you're in a weird spot where he is eligible for an extension. They ended up giving it to him, but now you're putting a lot more pressure on him because he has to almost validate that contract that you're giving him in a way, because he is up there to be paid accordingly, to be paid probably the highest paid quarterback in the NFL. Not probably, he is among the highest paid quarterbacks in the NFL. To be up there and not at least, make the playoffs is one thing. That's going to look very bad on not only the Jaguars and the players overall, but you could also argue that the pressure is on head coach Doug Peterson and general manager Trent Baalke, at least, like I mentioned, to make the playoffs. And with a wide receiver group as a question, you would think, all right, they have to transition. Let's look at the running backs. Maybe they could give us a little bit more stability. Everybody always talks about, building through the run, making it easier to build up the pass, but some sources close to the Jacksonville Jaguars have mentioned that Tank Bigsby, who Doug Peterson highlighted this offseason as wanting to get more involved in the offense, wanting to see grow into a bigger role, they've mentioned that the level of expectation around Tank Bigsby up until this point, based on his performances, hasn't been, as expected up until this point. Now, a lot could change when we get into training camp, but up until this point, Tank Bigsby hasn't really impressed too many people heading into his second year, knowing that Doug Peterson wants more out of him. So how they monitor that, because last year we saw how much Travis Etienne carried the burden, and he ended up getting hurt, and then the offense really started sputtering, and they couldn't find any more groove or rhythm to it. It all seemed very stagnant, and that's a big problem for them, and everybody's switching now to a running back duo. The Jaguars should do it. They believe that they can do it, but they need to see a little bit more out of Tank Bigsby. And just overall, my final thoughts on whether or not the Jaguars have met these expectations that I believe are there for Trevor Lawrence in this year, because 4 years in the NFL as a number one overall pick, now getting paid as one of the highest paid quarterbacks, we're going to have to see a little bit more now. Now there's going to be real consequences, I believe, for not meeting those expectations, because in all honesty, this offense could go either way. I wouldn't be surprised if they're really good with a faster development from Brian Thomas, from just better production from Christian Kirk and things like that. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they come out of the gate struggling, not really being on the same page because everyone's not up to speed with playing with each other. It could look a little bit clunky, but that's one thing. Really, the defense worries me more so than the offense, because not only did the entire division get better, but they got better offensively with Stephon Diggs, Joe Mixon going to Houston, Anthony Richardson coming back, Jonathan Taylor there, A.D. Mitchell being added to that group, Michael Pittman coming back, and also in Tennessee, they signed Calvin Ridley, not to mention from the Jaguars, much less, but also they signed Tyler Boyd, and they have more of an offensive-minded scheme going into 2024. My worry is that this defense just isn't built enough on the back end in the secondary where they can come up with a big stop when the pass rush just maybe they're a little bit too tired. Maybe they're just not getting there that day. The secondary's not holding up, and that is my main concern with this team overall. And I don't think they've done enough, the Jaguars overall, to meet these expectations that now come with Trevor Lawrence. That's just me. The way that they've handled free agency, they've brought in some good players in Eric Armstead and Darnell Savage to that defense, but I'm feeling like they need a little bit more. I'm not as confident as I am in them as opposed to the other teams in the division, at least two of them in the Titans and the Texans. And the last point I'll make here, when you're getting paid this much money, a lot of times you will be compared to other players that are making this much money. And when people look at just Joe Burrow, for example, who is also on a $55 million per year salary, they don't really talk about Trevor Lawrence in that same light compared to Joe Burrow, because when people talk about Joe Burrow, the stat, I think it was, whenever he plays at least 15 to 16 games, the Bengals have always made the AFC Championship game. People have come to expect that out of Joe Burrow, and Trevor Lawrence hasn't really been in those conversations yet, not to mention with Joe Burrow, but with Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, especially with all the talent that there is nowadays in just the quarterback position. If you don't separate yourself or you don't exceed expectations year in and year out, people are going to have a lot of questions, especially when you're getting a massive contract like this, if you're really worth it. And now heading into your fourth year, like I mentioned before, it's certainly going to be a lot more high stakes and bigger consequences, in my opinion, if the Jaguars, at least minimum, aren't the second best team in their division. And then if you're competing for a playoff spot and if it comes down to the wire and you just miss out, that's one thing. But if you're really struggling throughout the entire season and convincingly miss the playoffs, we're probably going to see some big changes next offseason. And I don't want to see Doug Peterson leave, but they already gave that money to Trevor. They already brought in a whole new pieces around him. It's going to be hard to pick out anybody else who they move on from, but it's in a weird spot right now. They just have to go out there and execute it at this point. So it should be exciting overall, that entire division, with how good it is. But talking about that division and talking about the Jaguars, we're going to continue to mention them in the next segment when I talk about the offseason grades for the entire AFC South division. We're going to get in here talking about the Colts, the Tennessee Titans, and the Houston Texans, on top of continuing on the points I made with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
We are back now talking about more on the AFC South that I just finished talking about in the last segment to get into the final off-season grades for the entire AFC South. This was the highest graded division in the entire NFL, at least just from off of my memory, from remembering all the other episodes that I did. This was definitely up there as the highest graded, so I wanted to get straight into it, talking about the first team I had on my list, that being the Indianapolis Colts. A young, exciting, and improving team overall. They were able to keep their number one receiver in Michael Pittman for what is now probably a bargain deal, making $23.3 million per year on a 3-year deal. You look at what everybody else is making, the highest paid receiver is making $12 million more than Michael Pittman, so that's an absolutely great deal for the Colts. Then you also look at being able to keep DeForest Buckner on a new deal as well. And the biggest topic around the Colts that I will get into later on in the show in a much deeper segment is that they were able to keep a lot of their key players like Kenny Moore, Zaire Franklin, Julian Blackmon, they're all back. They're all key pieces to this Colts team. And not only that, they were able to add a lot more youth and a lot more excitement to this team as if they needed any more with drafting Laiatu Latu at the number 15th overall pick. The first defensive player selected in the draft, if not the first, and he was definitely the second because of the run of quarterbacks and the offensive influx that was surrounding this entire draft in this first round. So getting him at 15, good value there for the Colts to add to a position of need. And drafting A.D. Mitchell, again, at a great value in the second round. Arguably could have gone late in the first round, but a lot of teams skipped over him, and now he is added to a great wide receiver group with Michael Pittman that I just finished talking about, Josh Downs. And you add that to the dynamic playability of Anthony Richardson combined with Jonathan Taylor in the backfield. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great to see, but that youth and that inexperience on the back end, on the defensive side of the ball, and really not to talk down on Anthony Richardson, but I think there will be more of a transition period that he only played 4 games, I want to say, in his first year. I think there's definitely going to be a learning curve there a little bit more, but this team should be more competitive, should be more fun to look at, and how Sean Steichen builds his offense and continues the development. But I think overall, for what they added, for what they got out of this offseason, I think a B is fair for definitely improving on what they're building as their core, as their culture there in Indianapolis. But with that being said now, the next team I wanted to mention is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And you see they're just a little bit lower than the Colts there at a B-, because I liked what they added. They definitely spent big. They spent a lot of money in bringing in Eric Armstead to keep Josh Allen, extending him to a massive deal. It was the right decision, but regardless, a lot of money, and also obviously a lot of money spent on Trevor Lawrence. He's good. He's definitely capable of getting better. I don't want to just write him off after 3 years, 2 not so good and 1 really good one. I think with these situations with pressure, a lot of times you could get a very bad situation, but also a very good situation. Pressure creates diamonds or bust pipes. Hopefully for the Jaguars, this is a great situation for them, because I like the addition of drafting Brian Thomas as well. I mentioned signing Darnell Savage on the back end will improve their secondary, but I didn't like that they lost Darius Williams in free agency, almost offsetting what they added with Darnell Savage. I know they're different positions, but if they would have kept both of them, it would have made the overall secondary a lot more secure and a lot more just more efficient, in my opinion. But how they sort of play out and sort of mask their deficiencies on the secondary will be something to watch at that defensive back position. And the biggest one, losing Calvin Ridley after a 1,000-yard season, I think decreases this offense's unpredictability, if that makes sense. If you had still Calvin Ridley on this team, along with Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, still Brian Thomas, and obviously Travis Etienne, it's a nightmare for opposing defenses to know who the ball is going to. Now you've narrowed it down a little bit more, And one of those players is a first-year player in Brian Thomas, so how much is he really going to contribute? You only really narrow it down. Oh, and also Gabe Davis, not to forget about him. You narrow it down a little, your options to Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, and Gabe Davis. So it's still a very good group, but obviously would have been better with Calvin Ridley. And to lose him to the Titans also stings a lot more. But overall, they added Mitch Morse, Ezra Cleveland. It should help their offensive line. But how is the transition going to go with so much newness coming in? I thought a B- would be appropriate for them because, again, uncertainty around Trevor Lawrence. Can they live up to those massive expectations? We shall see. But then just mentioning about the Tennessee Titans, we'll get to them. And I thought they had a very good offseason. A B+ for them just because they are entering into this new era, new identity in 2024, being a lot more not offensive, well, definitely more offensive, but a lot more pass-friendly because with Mike Vrabel, I thought they were more so on the run, and obviously you can't blame them because they had Derrick Henry right in the prime of his career, so that makes sense. It would be foolish not to use him that much, but now they're sort of changing into being more pass-heavy. You sign Calvin Ridley, obviously from the Jaguars. You sign Tyler Boyd, one of the best remaining free agents on the market. And it's not all about offense. It's not all about just pass game and putting up the most points. They added to that defense, especially with trading for L'Jarius Sneed, signing Chidobe Awuzie. That was big on the back end for a secondary. Now they're able to play a little bit more man coverage, have more people around the box to stop the running game, so that's always great for them. Dirty in there, but in terms of defensive improvements, in terms of one of the things that I thought they were lacking in, finding a pass rush, partner to Jeffrey Simmons, or just on the edges or alongside him on the interior, I thought was something that they could have looked towards adding a little bit more, but maybe the market just didn't work out for them. But regardless of that, overall, and how they're trying to change, the fact that they're trying to change their whole identity almost, and how successful they were by landing some of these big-name players, all under now the new head coach in Brian Callahan. I think for all their efforts and how successful they were, I think a B+ was very appropriate for them. And also on the offensive line, bringing in Lloyd Cushenberry, who is a very good underrated center as well, and drafting J.C. Latham, who is getting a lot of praise so far in OTAs and mandatory minicamps. So I think they're set up pretty nicely on the offensive side of the ball if they want to lean more into the pass, but it still remains a question mark on how Will Levis picks up this new offense. Not only picks up this new offense, but how he improves from what we saw last year, where he had some flashes of being very good, making some awesome throws, but at the same time, there were some ugly games in there, some very indecisive throws that you want to clean up. I think he fits very well into this offense. They've done a great job of surrounding him with talent. He just has to go out there and put his part into the entire equation. But regardless of that, big picture, the Titans did a very solid job starting a new era under Brian Callahan. So that only leaves one team. I've been a fan of them this entire time. I had to give them an A+. I had to, because if it wasn't going to be the Texans, nobody else was getting an A+. They're the last team that I'm grading this entire series, so nobody else has gotten an A+. It had to be the Texans as the last team to do it. Like I mentioned, they spent big and they went for it this offseason. I think a lot of teams are very hesitant and are very scared, a little bit doubtful of knowing that they have a great situation with, striking gold and finding your franchise quarterback, Tank Dell, Nico Collins breaking through. You're able to trade for Stephon Diggs. Even with all that going for yourself, going good for yourself, I think a lot of teams would have been content, comfortable with that, and just, cut it off right there. Nick Caserio, their general manager, alongside head coach D'Amico Ryans, I wanted to praise them for being extra aggressive and being very straightforward and wanting to go out there and improve all of this team by bringing in Danielle Hunter on the defensive side of the ball. Also, they added Azeez Al-Shaair, I want to say, also as a linebacker to this team. And it also helps it makes it easier, this transition, a lot when you have great cornerstone pieces like a Jalen Petrie, a CJ Stroud, obviously, a Tank Dell, Nico Collins, Will Anderson, Derek Stingley. They've done a great job of drafting these great players, and now they're all still super young, and that now they're serving as these cornerstone pieces, like I mentioned, being extra aggressive and being extra, or just being proactive in free agency and going out there and getting the players that you want to really go all in on this team. I really wanted to praise them because you don't really see that a lot in the NFL. And also adding a guy like Joe Mixon, they don't really need him, honestly, but adding him just really puts the frosting on the cake overall on how great this team just went from, all right, they're sort of good, CJ's going to be great, but now everyone's looking at them as a potential contender for the number 1 seed in the AFC, really competing with the Patriots, with the Ravens. It should be exciting. It should be awesome. Their only weak point I would sort of point out would be at defensive back, because I know they have Derek Stingley, but they drafted Lassiter, I want to say is his name, from Georgia. I could have completely butchered that, but they added him. They're very happy with him, but he's still a rookie. If they add another corner, just some more help to that secondary after, I'm forgetting their corner that they had now, that just retired. Regardless of that, if they add some more depth there, another piece there, a veteran piece, I think there would be nothing left to improve. That's the only thing, but I had to give them an A+. And I'd love to know what you guys think about it. Do you guys think I'm overdoing it on the Texans? Are you guys getting tired of me talking about the Texans? But regardless of that, A+ for them. Leave your guys' thoughts in the chat box or in the comments section afterwards. But that'll do it for right now, talking about the AFC South. But when we return, we're going to take a slight break from this division and ways that sources closer to the team have pointed out that some of us outsiders aren't able to see from an external point of view. So I wanted to talk some more about that when we return in just a few seconds after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Moving right along with the next segment, switching away from the AFC South just for a moment and talking some more about the Los Angeles Chargers. Some of the biggest takeaways that sources closer to the team have pointed out that maybe some of us fans or some of us just on the outside looking in have noticed but don't really know too many details about it. But overall, as just some context, we're exactly 21 days away, 3 weeks away from when the Los Angeles Chargers have to report to training camp on July 23rd, and their first practice will be the following day on July the 24th. There's already been a lot of changes, obviously. Jim Harbaugh coming in, establishing a new identity, a lot more of a tougher mindset, a lot more run-heavy, building the passing game off of that. And I think it's a good thing for the Chargers, obviously, to do this with this team, because a lot is being said about how Harbaugh is already making these changes, but from what we see, we don't really see too much on the outside. You see it, you see the players that they're bringing in, Joe Alt, Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins. Some of these guys, you already get an idea of that they want to run the ball, they want to establish that sort of intimidation factor with this team that Harbaugh is trying to bring in from his time in Michigan and how successful that was, and just how successful he was at the NFL level, obviously with the 49ers most recently. I think it's a great thing. It's a great match, but now we get to dive into a little bit more deeper things that I am very pleasantly surprised by, but also very, content with seeing that Harbaugh and just this team is embracing now. So one of the biggest points that has been mentioned so far through OTAs, mandatory minicamp, and things like that have been the big name players, the players that have made it over from this transition from Brandon Staley to Jim Harbaugh, being Justin Herbert, Khalil Mack, and Joey Bosa. All of the big name players, according to the sources, are really buying in to this new character, identity, and just attitude overall that Jim Harbaugh is trying to bring to the Los Angeles Chargers. Starting off with Justin Herbert. If you've heard Justin Herbert talk or if you've seen him, you know he's not really too much of a outgoing personality. He usually keeps the answers short when he's talking to the media. He says all the right things, all the politically correct things. Not too much, outside the box things that you'd expect from him. Everything he says is pretty much the typical quarterback answer. So it's not a bad thing. It's just who he is. That's what people have come to expect. But now he's talking for a lot longer. It was mentioned according to some of these sources. Usually it's very short, very brief with the media, but one of the media sessions that they had lasted about 30 minutes. Justin Herbert was cracking jokes, talking about going on stage with Zach Bryan over the course of this offseason. Just really, you could see it on his face how excited he was, how much looser he was in terms of just letting go a little bit more from a personality standpoint. So that was nice to see. And the same goes with Khalil Mack, joking, smiling, talking for a lot longer. He even said it when he was walking away from the media in one of these media sessions, looking back to them and saying that that they got a lot more out of him, that he usually doesn't do that. But I think that just comes along with what Jim Harbaugh and the personality, the contagious personality that he brings, that I will, explain a little bit later on in this segment. But the last piece of the puzzle, the last piece of this big three that has survived this transition was Joey Bosa. And he wasn't too giddy, too happy about it, but he was more direct in his approach by saying that the clarity and the directness of Jim Harbaugh's ideas are a lot more, are a lot more clear and a lot more direct. And one thing that I thought was super interesting was that he mentioned how the message, the overall goal, and just main idea of what Jim Harbaugh is trying to establish isn't lost as it moves down the ladder, meaning that it isn't, lost in translation when you're getting the call from a defensive coordinator, your position coach. Everybody is giving the exact same message, and I think that's it's remarkable that Jim Harbaugh has a staff like that, able to relay their message out to everybody the exact same way. But it's certainly going to help make this whole transition a lot less intimidating, and it's going to give more confidence, and they could just learn off of that by every single coach telling them the exact same thing to do. I thought that was super interesting, that I didn't know of right off the bat. But on that point, moving on to the next biggest takeaway that I saw according to some of these sources was that more on Justin Herbert embracing a little bit more of the spotlight. And I just finished talking about how Herbert, not the most, if you were to compare personalities, he isn't so much like a Patrick Mahomes, so much like a Josh Allen, or even a Lamar Jackson. The personalities are very different when you're talking all those quarterbacks compared to Justin Herbert in the past. But now it was sort of a funny point that was brought up because Herbert has been known to be a little bit more reserved, not liking too much to be the center of attention, feeling like everybody is looking at him. But that is exactly what Jim Harbaugh has almost made him do through this offseason period, OTAs, and mandatory minicamp, because like I'm sure most of you know, the quarterbacks have either red jerseys or a different colored jerseys than everybody else, just so everybody knows not to hit the quarterback, obviously, in practice. And Jim Harbaugh has made only Justin Herbert, out of all the quarterbacks, out of all the other players on the offensive side of the ball, he's the only one wearing a gold jersey. And obviously, you see how Justin Herbert wouldn't be too comfortable with it at the start, but it has been pointed out that he has embraced it a little bit more, just buying in fully to what Jim Harbaugh and his ideas were. That was a rule that Jim Harbaugh wanted to implement, so I like the fact that Herbert is just accepting it. He's loosening up, like I mentioned, a little bit more, and it's a bigger point because now he's in a bigger role with this team, and it might not seem like it because it might seem like they want to run the ball a lot more, but it is a lot more on him in a way because they did take away so many of his weapons. They did take away so much of this offensive firepower that when they do pass the ball, there's a lot more responsibility and almost higher stakes for Justin Herbert to make the right read, be on the same page as everybody and relay the message clearly out there to everybody. So when they do pass the ball, it is efficient. It doesn't slow up this offense where it's stuttering every time you try to pass the ball. And now you're in a 3rd and long, a 2nd and long, really just stalling this offense. And I like how Herbert's embracing it. He is accepting this bigger role in a way and loosening up a little bit more. It's contagious just from Jim Harbaugh that I mentioned before. His personality, if you've ever seen Jim Harbaugh talk or just answer some questions from the media, you don't really know when he's being serious. It always seems like he doesn't take anything for granted. He always has a smile on his face. They always say, he always brings up that quote that him and his brother John Harbaugh always say, from their childhood, from their dad always saying, who's got it better than us? Having that and almost implementing that into this team, keeping everything serious, but at the same time being very lighthearted about everything, keeping everything loose, not too much pressure on these players. He's really invigorating that into this offense and just this team in general, where the pressure is certainly on to be successful now after the Chargers haven't been for so long, but he's making it almost very light on these players' shoulders, and I really like that. As I get into the last point, talking some more about the rookies as the last biggest takeaway and how impactful they have been. Some of them have been so far through this offseason. You have Jim Harbaugh praising their first-round selection in Joe Alt, pretty much naming him a starter up until this point with how much he has praised him, how much he has been talking about how ready Joe Alt is and how open he is to being coached and everything. Just saying all the right things. Joe Alt doing all the right things to get on the coach's good side. He is obviously a great player, but now it seems like Jim Harbaugh is really buying into it, really liking what he's seeing. So if anybody had any doubts about Joe Alt starting, those are probably wiped away from what Jim Harbaugh said about Joe Alt. Then you get into Ladd McConkey, their 2nd-round selection, and he has been described as the best route runner out there for the team, not just among the rookies, but the entire team on the offensive side of the ball. And Justin Herbert said, in his words, he's just picked up the offense so easily, it's like he's been a 4 or 5 year vet. That's what Justin Herbert said on how impressed he's been about Ladd McConkey and how, early on he's been very successful in this offense. And with way should dive right into being a prominent role in this offense because of the loss of Keenan Allen. Austin Eckler's not there. Mike Williams also moved on. You have Quentin Johnson, probably Ladd McConkey, and maybe Brendan Rice or somebody like that. Not too much depth at this position, and if Ladd McConkey can provide some sort of excitement, some sort of change of pace, he's definitely going to get in there. Big expectations to try and provide right away, but from what I've seen, from what I've heard, and how they describe him, it seems like everyone believes he can do it, so that's a great thing for them. And lastly, a name that not a lot of people have probably heard about, I certainly haven't heard about, is Tarheeb Still, a 5th-round defensive back out of Maryland. Probably the biggest surprise out of all this rookie class and how good he has performed, already playing with the first-team defense, a lot of pass breakups, and he actually got an interception versus the first-team offense in one of their practices as well. And his performances has drawn praise from probably the leader of that defense in Derwin James. He has, had some praise very much so for Tarheeb Still, and also their defensive coordinator, Jesse Minter, hasn't been shy about saying how impressed he has been with Still up until this point. The Chargers, really on all standpoints, could use as much help as they can, and the fact that they're getting major contributions, it seems already, from some of their young players, is only going to benefit them. They're not going to be in the playoff race per se. They're not going to be in contention really for a division title, or maybe they will if the Raiders aren't, that great. But, this is still a very much a work in progress. This is still in phase 1 of what the Chargers eventually want to look like, but it all seems to be going very well. It seems like everyone's embracing the change. Everyone's embracing just learning what Jim Harbaugh is saying. He's preaching the gospel, it seems like, for them, and they're all just absorbing it. I'm excited to see what they produce out there because it is so different, being very much run first compared to everybody else going pass heavy. So that dynamic, that difference in style should be something to watch in 2024. But that being said, we're going to shift over to the AFC South once again and talk about the Indianapolis Colts and their general manager, Chris Ballard, talking about why they didn't do too much in free agency, what was the reason behind that, and do I agree with it, and some realistic expectations we could foresee in the Indianapolis Colts in 2024. So that segment plus some more talking points on the Carolina Panthers and how they plan to execute their offense as well in this season. Both of those topics are coming up in just a few moments. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back here now to jump into another segment, back into the AFC South and talking a little bit more on the Indianapolis Colts. What are some realistic expectations for the Colts this year? Because I just finished talking about them in my offseason grades, that they're exciting. They're definitely in a point where a lot of people could have those hyperbole sort of expectations for them. You know, could they challenge the Texans or the Jaguars right away with how good this offense does look on paper, but there obviously has to do a lot more with that, and how they complement this offense, how they make it a little bit more efficient is the free agency activity, how you bring in players to make this team better. But from that standpoint, the Colts really didn't do too much of adding and too much of bringing in new guys to this whole project, because in free agency, they made it clear from the start that bringing back their guys was really their top priority this offseason. And if you look at that, based on their actions, they only signed 2 new players that weren't on their roster from last year. That was Joe Flacco and Raekwon Davis. Everybody else was just a re-signing. Everybody else was just being brought back. 10 players that were on the roster came back in free agency. Some of them included Julian Blackmon, Kenny Moore, Zaire Franklin, Michael Pittman, Grover Stewart, the defensive tackle, and a new deal for DeForest Buckner as well. Those are only some of the names that came back. Some of their important players for sure, but it just seems like some Colts fans wanted more to be brought in, but why they didn't exactly do that, well, general manager Chris Ballard sort of talked about it here in a quote that I found from one of his press conferences, as you guys can see on your screen. He said, "I know a lot of times people want change. They see the shiny car on the other side, but a lot of times, the players, they are the type of teammates they are, the type of work they will put in, the type of continuity, especially during the second half of the season, will bode well for us this year." Also, Chris Ballard didn't shy away about mentioning that they didn't see really much of a difference from bringing in different players in comparison to the players that they already had on their roster, they hit free agency, and that they wanted to bring back in that same sentiment. So, interesting quote, especially that last part when he said, especially during the second half of the season, will bode well for us this year. And the fact that he said, the continuity, that was one of the biggest words in that final sentiment that I wanted to highlight, because that is one of the most important things I think that I took away from what the Colts did, trying to figure out, why they didn't add anybody. How could you not want to make this team better in a way by adding some free agents that they certainly could have used from what they need, from their positions of need. But I can also understand what Chris Ballard is saying here in a way, because of the point of where the Indianapolis Colts are where they are at this moment. They're in a point of, just almost reaching the top of the hill. They're right on the, summit of it, and getting over it, and finally being, at that surface where they could really be considered contenders. They're on their way there. They're on their way to finally getting over that hump, I believe. with how impressive I think they did in the draft and just building on this offense. But doing that and getting to that point and finally getting over that hump is going to take that continuity, that chemistry, and that just overall comfort you have with the players that you know are going to fit into this system. When a lot of times when teams bring in new players, it looks great on paper. Obviously, not too long ago, we saw Russell Wilson being brought in for a lot of money to the Denver Broncos. It looks fantastic on paper, right? It looks awesome when you project him fitting into this team. They only need a quarterback, right? The Denver Broncos are only a quarterback away from being absolute contenders. Russell Wilson, he comes in. It doesn't matter how much we paid him. He's going to produce. He's going to take us to the Super Bowl and all that sort of things. But it looks great on paper. And then once you get into the season, he doesn't have a good season at all in his first year. It gets a little bit better in his second year, but the Broncos are still not considered a very good team. And that's sort of where I think Chris Ballard was going with this point, where you want to bring in for sure, or at least you don't want to lose the players that you know fit into this offense, fit into what you're trying to build. And I think it goes a long way when these players, like a Kenny Moore, like a Julian Blackmon, who was close to leaving at one point in free agency, where they have that opportunity to leave, but at the same time, they decide to sign back. They decide to buy into this project, this whole journey that they've been on with the Colts. And at that same time, you have those players wanting to come back, because not only is that great, that it shows that they want to be here, but also that they're buying into what you're building here in the Colts. And as the general manager from top to bottom in this organization, they've really bought into it. And again, they certainly could have left. I know players like Kenny Moore, Julian Blackmon, like I mentioned, Zaire Franklin, I'm sure had other offers out there to sign somewhere else, but they decided to stay here. And Michael Pittman as well. He was tagged, so he really didn't get a chance to test out the free agent market. But some of the deals, if you look that they handed out, and in terms of actual free agents, if you look at Michael Pittman's deal, he would have been the second biggest deal, just talking about free agents, if he wasn't tagged. The contract that he got would have been the second biggest deal handed out in this free agent period, only second to Calvin Ridley's deal that he had, but obviously Michael Pittman was tagged. And then you also look at Grover Stewart's deal that he received from the Colts, which was the second largest among free agent defensive tackles, to bring him back, and Kenny Moore, the second largest contract handed out to a defensive back in free agency, to return to the Colts as well. So I think that also just shows how important this team was, or how important these players were to this team, how important they were to the point where the Colts didn't really hesitate to spend a lot of money on them. It might seem like a lot in terms of, you see the second highest contract given out to a defensive back or a free agent or to a potential wide receiver, and you might think that's maybe overdoing it, but the Colts are really adamant that these are the players that they want. These are the players that they want to represent them, and they're doing a good thing, I believe, all in all, because they're certainly at a point where these expectations that we can have for them now, like I mentioned, they're right there almost at the summit. And I think this continuity, learning off of each other, building this bond with all the players, this core group of players, is going to be that next step into getting to the summit and then finally getting over it. Maybe next offseason you get that real game changer, that real X factor on the defensive side of the ball, ideally for me. And that way you start stepping into that next level of competing with the Texans, competing with, I don't know, somebody else in the AFC, the Steelers, the Jets, the Bills, all these teams that I think are around the same level. That's where the Colts are heading. That's their next step, and they're right there. They're really close, but for right now, the expectations that I see for the Colts coming into this year is that they're going to be great competition. From an offensive standpoint, they're going to be very tough to stop. They have a lot of weapons all over the field. From a wide receiver standpoint, from the running back standpoint, from the running game in general, just talking about Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor. Then also, that's going to be great. They're probably not going to be in too many, they're not going to lose too many shootouts is what I'm trying to say, but at the same time, where I see them lacking is on that defensive side of the ball. You do bring back some great secondary pieces, but I think you could have used some more pass rushing to add to that defensive line, to add to DeForest Buckner, but we'll see. Up until this point, I probably foresee them maybe competing for second at best. Second because the Titans and the Jaguars are very similar to each other in a way where the Titans are starting to step into this new era. The Jaguars have already sort of been there last year, how good they were to how disappointing they were towards the end of last year. But the Colts, it really stunk for them last year that Anthony Richardson wasn't there, because he could have had some more time to develop, and they could have pushed those teams a little bit more. But now that he is there, that talent gap has sort of closed a little bit, and I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they were challenging for second place, because I don't think anybody is really touching the Houston Texans, in my opinion. If the Colts can compete for that second spot, I don't think it's impossible for them to do that, but in between second or third, anywhere finishing in that area, I don't think it's going to be that hard for them to do by any means. Chris Ballard has done a great job of building this team up, drafting them, holding on to some draft picks, and really buying into the guys that he believes in. They're on the right path, and like I mentioned, they're almost there, but I would give it another season, another offseason before I really consider them for a wild card spot or something like that. But that's just me. Leave your guys' thoughts on where you guys see the Colts finishing this year, or how good really they could be. Could they surprise a lot of people, or do you think they're a lot further back than where I have them projected to be in this upcoming season? But we have one more segment to talk about on today's show. We're going to head into a quick break, and when we return, we're going to mention the new strategy that Dave Canales is trying to implement for the Carolina Panthers. What is his number one priority that he wants to see out of this offense to really help them blossom into a great, or a greater than what they were last year, picture out of them in 2024. So stay with the show. We're going to be right back after this to talk some more about the Carolina Panthers. We are back here now on the show to dive into the last segment that I wanted to touch on here for the last few minutes of this show. The Panthers and what they're trying to establish as their number one priority on offense. That would be the running game, because last year, not great at all for the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, you go 2-15 last year when they fired Frank Reich. Also, Bryce Young not having the best of times in his first year in the NFL, especially when he's getting compared to CJ Stroud and them being drafted right next to each other. That's always going to be a conversation, and it's not a great start for him compared to how CJ Stroud started his campaign in the NFL. And then now you have Dave Canales stepping in as a first-time head coach, where it could bring some more question marks in terms of this team by bringing in a guy that has never been in this role before. Even though he had success with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, there's still a difference there. I always believe that some coaches, some, people just in general blossom or just are more efficient in certain roles as an offensive coordinator. Maybe some people are way better at that than they are head coaches. It just doesn't always translate into the next progression. Sometimes people just reach a level that they're comfortable at, and that's just it. We're going to have to see how it is for Dave Canales, but this is a great opportunity for him nonetheless to get his name out there a lot more in a situation where there's not a lot of expectations, but at the same time, there almost is, because you want to get the most out of Bryce Young because of how much they've invested in him. And I think they're already doing a better job of surrounding him with better talent around him, because my biggest issue last year was the fact that I didn't think this team was ready to draft Bryce Young. The fact that they traded with the Chicago Bears to get that pick and they still drafted him anyway. They weren't ready at all. I didn't like the receivers that they had. Their offensive line was still spotty. The defense didn't really complement the offense in a way where they could have bailed them out a lot of times. And the running game, again, wasn't something to be so dominant that Bryce Young could really just rely on that as well. This entire whole situation just seemed like it was a year in advance to drafting Bryce Young. But now I already like a little bit more what they're doing with this team, bringing in guys like Deontay Johnson, Damian Lewis, on the offensive line, Robert Hunt as well on the offensive line, and Xavier Legette out of the University of South Carolina. So some good names there, important names, because you get two interior offensive linemen, you get and two skilled players out there on the outside in Deontay and Legette, and Dave Canales. Now, while all of that almost screams to have Bryce Young be better at, passing, being a quarterback, what comes with being a quarterback, obviously passing the ball and being more efficient in that area, Dave Canales has already established that it might not be so much of the passing game, but more so of the running game, when he said recently it all starts with the run game, and he continued on after that when he said that's what this draft and this offseason was all about. I feel confident that we'll be able to have a successful run game, which for me opens up everything else. It helps third down, it helps move the ball and give you more opportunities. The last part is crucial for me, just give you more opportunities, because when you saw the Panthers last year, it almost seemed like every series that they went out there for, it was going to be a 3-and-out. That's the level of, deficiency, the level of, how bad this got for the Carolina Panthers. That's how bad it got, where you'd expect them to go out there in every series to just be a 3-and-out. You were more surprised when they got a first down than when they didn't get a first down and they went 3-and-out. That's the level of where this offense was last year, and a lot of that had to do with a rookie quarterback coming in, just not having a lot of help around him. But now they're doing that a little bit better, and people, like I mentioned, would have thought that this would right away put Dave Canales in a situation where they want to improve the passing game, but he is going more so with the running game. And I think that's interesting because they have Miles Sanders there already. You have Chuba Hubbard there, who, are solid pieces, I guess, to have as a running back duo, but not too many people were convinced when they drafted Jonathan Brooks, who was tagged as the best running back in this class, coming off of a very serious knee injury. A lot of people were confused by that, but now it's starting to open it up a little bit more on why they did that, to have him be maybe more of a prominent role. Are they going to throw three running backs out there? Probably not. When Jonathan Brooks comes back, I would probably assume that he will take a bigger role in this offense, maybe some carries away from Miles Sanders, because he came in on a decent contract for him after playing with the Philadelphia Eagles, but he almost lost his job to Chuba Hubbard, and that doesn't paint a good picture overall for what his future could look like with the Carolina Panthers. So that's one thing. Jonathan Brooks could be a major contributor right away for this team, but how much can he really do off of that knee injury? And I think just monitoring what Dave Canales said and wanting to build the running game, we still have to monitor our expectations for the biggest piece of all of this, which is Bryce Young, because you always hear about people talking about how a rookie quarterback or a young quarterback's best friend is always a great running game, and that's where I think Dave Canales wants to go eventually, what he wants Bryce Young to, blossom into, but I think we still have to monitor the expectations we have for this, because it all sounds good, but I don't expect them to go out there and have this great top 15 running game. It's certainly going to be better than what they had last year, because it is hard to be worse than 2-15. So you're already working with a low bar of standards. So you're only going to really get better. I don't see how you get worse. So that, on top of monitoring our expectations for Bryce Young, because the last thing you want this to be is another failed situation where Dave Canales comes in there, he absolutely bombs as a head coach, and now you're trying to look again for another head coach who will maybe not have the running game as their first priority, and now you throw Bryce Young into a very bad situation where he had Frank Reich, now he had Dave Canales. If this doesn't go well, you move on from him and bring on somebody else. That's the last thing you want. Is in the first 3 years of being a quarterback, it wouldn't paint a very good picture. And overall, I just want to see stability with this Carolina Panthers team in a division where everybody is pretty much pass heavy. If you look at everybody else in that division, the Buccaneers with Baker, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, the Falcons obviously with Kirk now, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, the New Orleans Saints a little bit with Chris Olave and Derek Carr. They're not too proficient overall as an offense, but the majority of those two other teams are very pass heavy. So the fact that the Panthers are going away from that a little bit, almost like the Los Angeles Chargers in that division with having the Raiders and how they're very talented on offense with all their weapons. Same with the Chiefs. It doesn't go without saying how talented they are. The Chargers are going in a little bit of a different direction, and now the Panthers are following that script a little bit. So it intrigues me to see how successful it is when they do play against the Falcons, when they do play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, how running the ball, how successful it'll be, one, but how efficient it'll be in stopping the other team's opposing offenses when they're not on the field as much, they're not in rhythm as much. I think it's something to point out. I think it's something that the Panthers want to eventually get to, but how successful they will be, it will depend a lot on Jonathan Brooks' health, because he could be very successful for them in this improving offensive line, how talented he was and successful he was for Texas. So the Panthers are slowly getting all the pieces of the puzzle together. They only have a few of those pieces on the board right now, but this is a long-term project. I want to emphasize that for any Panthers fans or anything out there watching this, wanting to know what the Panthers' idea is behind all of this. It's going to get there, hopefully with Dave Canales, because I want him to do good. A young head coach trying out his luck, being a first-time head coach should be interesting. He had success with the Bucs. He had a lot to do with how Baker developed into what he is now. So hopefully we get the same outcome here with the Panthers and Bryce Young, and to make that division also a little bit more competitive, not just the Falcons and the Bucs, as everybody predicts it'll most likely be into this year. Hopefully the Panthers can sneak into there in the years to come, but that'll do it. That'll wrap it up for this episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network on all forms of social media, Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok for additional content. And if you want to see more of this show, check out the GSMC Podcast and GSMC Sports Network channels on YouTube to check out more forms of NFL content on both of those channels on YouTube. And as a final reminder, tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more discussions and just conversations around the NFL with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you guys for joining me on today's show, and I expect to see you guys back here again with me tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't